Good afternoon. I'm Rebecca Ruth Gould of the University of Birmingham, and I'm with Kayvan Tahmasebian, also of the University of Birmingham. We're going to be talking about two books. The first is the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Activism, known for short as RHTA, which we co-edited. And also we're going to be talking about our new book on translation and activism, also published by Routledge. And we'll also be touching on our, in some ways very different, and in some ways quite similar personal paths as translators. And Kayvan has the first question to kick off our conversation.
Rebecca, what theories are important to how you think about translation and activism?
So there are two theorists who I would really have to single out. The first is Jean Rancière, who in The Politics of Literature says that the politics of literature is not the politics of its writers. And I think this quote is particularly relevant to translation. It applies to all writing, and he's not specifically referring to translation. But it's always true, as we know, that when an author writes a text, that author has no control over the ultimate fate of the text. And that is true many times more, of course, with translation, because once a text is translated, it has its own agency. And not only does the author not have full control over the fate and the impact of that text, but even the translator doesn't have ultimate control. And I think we can think about this as a very empowering message that it gives to translators and to activists, that we cannot always foretell the consequences of what we translate. What we translate may be forgotten, in its immediate context, but someday it may matter tremendously. And another theorist who's really important to me is someone who's important to a lot of people, a lot of translators in particular, I know you as well, Walter Benjamin. Is particularly his work, The Task of the Translator. And I see the key takeaway of that very important essay from the perspective of translation and activism as being that he really insists that sometimes the most difficult translations, the one that most resist our comprehension or that are most literal and most resist the culture that the text is being translated into, some of those are the ones that sometimes these are the translations that have the greatest impact and the greatest power, because they push the boundaries of language and what is possible, and they really demand a lot of the reader. But that is real work that can have a transformative potential. Like, I think one clear example that was also important for Benjamin is Holderlin's translation of Greek tragedy, right? His German is not a typical German, it's a kind of contorted German. So those are the two theorists that I would identify as having kind of the most productive potential for thinking about the intersections of translation and activism. So now I'm going to ask you the same question that you asked me. So what theorists have been important to you throughout this project in terms of how you think about translation and activism?
I can think of two theoretical classics in the field, Maria Timoshko and Mana Baker. Maria Timoshko argues for activist translation as partiality, as some form of taking side with, as being biased. So according to her, translator as partisan manipulates the original to reach the intended effect. So the idea of activism is tied into the translator's agency. Activist translation is politically engaged, and engagement is defined in terms of taking part in a battle or conflict. And translation is activist when it participates in changing the existing power relations, which are supposed to represent discrimination and injustice. Her argument is modeled after the Irish independence through the transformation of the hero Cuchulainn. And in Baker's work, we see power structures and mechanisms and the resistance to these structures as framed within a narrative theory. Power generates narrative to maintain itself. Power is exerted through narratives and their propagators and their guardians. And resistance means to create alternative narratives. Baker's model is groups of translators, mostly volunteers who aid humanitarian and activist causes such as Traduttori per la Pace and Translators Without Borders and Babels.
And both of those theorists have, of course, written very explicitly about the relationship of translation and activism.
Yeah, exactly. Rebecca, what's the possible future you imagine for translation and activism as a field of studies?
Well, I think we should be hopeful because it's really just begun. I mean, people have really just only begun to recognize in a really explicit way the activist potential of translation. And unfortunately, injustice is never going to go away, I think, certainly not in the near future, so it's always going to be necessary. I think there are two developments that I really see taking place. One is that translational activism is going to develop a kind of paradoxical relationship with English, which is really a language that it's a super language in terms of its power, mega power language, and very closely aligned with a lot of the world's injustices, a lot of corporate politics and power. And I think a lot of, in the one hand, translation is really central to challenging the hegemony of global English. So I think there's going to be increasing importance of translation among languages, sort of the minor languages of the world, like, for example, Swahili and Pashto, or these sort of languages that are on the peripheries. I think there will be more connections among what we might call the global southern languages and literatures, and reading novels and fiction, and also will take place. And hopefully English will cease to be so central as it is now as an intermediary language, and sometimes the translations will be done directly from these minor languages. I think that's an activist development that I expect to take place over the next few decades. And another inevitable change, I think, is just the increased use of technology. Even Google Translate, and for all its flaws, I think both you, Kayvan, and I have seen how you can get some pretty remarkable results when translating from Persian into English, right? I don't know if it goes the other way too. Do you think it does? The effectiveness of Google Translate from English into Persian? Yes.
It has improved a lot.
Uh-huh.
It has improved a
Right.
lot in the past decade.
Right. So the use of machine translation, not that it's never going to fully eclipse translation, of course, I mean, done by humans, but it's impossible to ignore the activist potential of the various technological tools we have at our disposal at maybe making translation a bit faster, a bit more automated, although I think the human agency is never going to go away. But it's a question of, can activists adequately harness these tools to pursue activist ends? And what about you? What kind of future do you see for activist translation?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I imagine a flourishing future for the field of studies in collaboration with social movement studies and contentious politics in a post 9/11 world of global demonstrations, generalist strike actions, riots, civil disobedience, revolution, displacement, migrations, and insurrections. Certainly through this collaboration, new and effective strategies, tactics, and techniques will be developed for the translator in new activist positions, as a defender, as a striker, as a supporter, and yeah, that's it.
So Kayvan, as you know, one of the first things that I think we agreed on, and we agreed on so much during editing this volume, which was really made it a lot of fun, is that we didn't just want to limit ourselves to the contemporary moment, and we didn't just want to limit ourselves to modernity. We were also interested in kind of looking at the beginnings of activist translation and the pre-modern precedents of activist translation. I think that comes through to some extent in our table of contents. So I just wondered, could you reflect a little bit about any examples of activist translation before modernity, also any differences between activist translation in the pre-modern period and the modern?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my favorite example of pre-modern activist translator is Dara Shukoo, the Mughal prince, son of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal. who was also a prolific writer and translator.
Right.
He translated 52 principal Upanishads into Persian, which can be considered a good example of a committed translation project, along with his writings in comparative religion and studies, gathered in Majma' al-Bahrain. The title can be translated as The Mingling of the Two Oceans. He believed that Islamic monotheism and Hindu henotheism are different from each other only verbally. He compared terms and concepts across Islam and Vedanta and tried to establish a cultural synthesis between the followers of the two faiths. However, his activism for tolerance and dialogue among cultures cost him his life, unfortunately. In the conflicts of power over succession to the throne, his brother Aurangzeb used Darashuko's translation and his association with Hindu yogis as a proof of his heresy and declared his beliefs were a danger to Islam. Darashuko was executed in Delhi in 1659.
So
Very
that's a
tragic.
reminder, that's a reminder that the stakes of activist translation can be really high, including in the pre-modern period.
Exactly, and still there are translators, interpreters around the world who lose their lives
Absolutely.
over their ideals for more justice in the world.
Absolutely.
And what about you? Do you have any pre-modern instance of translational activism?
Oh, sure. There are many. I'll just give sort of an obvious one that most people are probably familiar with, but maybe we don't think of this in terms of activism. That's Luther, Martin Luther, of course. You know, when he insisted on translating the Bible into German, that was a radically political act because it made suddenly the language of this sacred text that was seen as laying the foundations for not just the religious law but also political order was made accessible to people. And it's significant that Protestant Reformation began with an act of translation. So I think, and he was working, I guess, a bit earlier than Darashuko, but similar currents were happening in the world at the same time. We can see actually also in Central Asia, there's sort of the birth of new literatures and new languages. The Turkic poets were beginning to translate Persian poets. Jami, for example, was being translated by Navai, the Turkic Uzbek poet, into his own language. And he saw that as a political act because it was a way of kind of getting away from the classical models, getting away from the received teachings of Persian culture in that case, and asserting a more vernacular source for identity and political power. So certainly language has been political ever since people first began to speak, and I think the history of activist translation shows that.
And any modern instances?
Of course. Most of the best known examples of translational activism are rooted in the kind of modernist turn, the idea of the demos as the origin of where the power should be located. Well, for example, in Iran, one famous case we could think of is the translation of Sartre's What is Literature, right? His pamphlet, very programmatic effort to turn literature into a political agenda, not just a kind of aesthetic reflection of the world. And that was translated as Adabiyat Shist by Abu Hassan Najafi and Mustafa Rahimi. And as I know, that was a really influential translation. I think it was done in 1973, so 5 years before the revolution, published by the major publisher Zaman, right? So it really set the tone for Iranians of the idea of committed literature and how the decision that one might undertake to become a writer was also a decision to become an activist. It set in advance what one's positions might be in terms of equality, gender hierarchies, power hierarchies. So I think that's a good example. There are other examples, but that's probably one influential example for Iran. Also, of course, Gramsci is a great theorist of the power of activist translation, the way he thinks about Dante, for example, the way he really looks to different corners of world literature and incorporates that into his vision of Marxism. So those would be the two most inspiring examples for me from the modern period.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's actually try to give listeners a sense of what it was actually like to work on this book, because I kind of think that in itself was its own kind of activist act. At least I really enjoyed it. Kayvan, what did you learn the most, and how was your opinions changed most significantly by the actual editorial process of working on this book?
To put it as shortly as possible and as far as I can remember, it was a wonderful experience of solidarity in global network of resistance. I mean, including citizen activists, internet activists, media activists, peace activists, protesters, guerrillas, and many others who resist inequality, injustice, oppression, discrimination, and human suffering all around the world. Just like the map of a city that, in the eyes of a radical protester, is transformed into an intricate network of hiding, gathering, scattering, and escaping from security forces, the activist translator discovers and reveals and highlights the translational sensitivities of oppressive power relations. This is what I learned, how to look at activist translations from this point of view, okay, as how they reveal the translational sensitivities of power structures.
Mm-hmm.
What about you?
And also, I would just add, from very global perspectives, right? That was
Exactly.
Gave us a new vantage point in many different geographies. Well, I think for me, it gave me a new perspective on something that we've been involved in different ways, but this project offered a new vantage point on, which is co-authorship and co-editorship as well. And really also helped me to appreciate, it was really appropriate that became the focus, or was the kind of means through which we pursued the subjects focused on translation and activism, because I think at the end of the day, every activist translation does involve some kind of sense of co-agency. It's very rarely taking place as just an isolated translator, isolated individual producing words. There should be an audience. There should be a kind of co-creation process of more than one person. In the case of this volume, we had many contributors who were co-authors. In other words, we had chapters written by multiple people, and it was really interesting to see that process. You know, how did each contributor, each co-author manage their own voices within the text. Some sort of chose their own different sections to focus on. Some just drafted the text together. It was interesting to see the different modalities of co-authorship, and then it was interesting to experience co-authorship as well, because of course we wrote the introduction together. We challenged each other's views a lot. I know you really helped me to think about the relationship between activism and politics as something that should not be used interchangeably. And I think, so we challenged each other's views, we questioned each other's views, we prevented maybe cliches from just going past without observation. So I think a good co-author is also a really good critic and a really good co-editor. Sure. So it just gave me a new sense of the possibility of what happens when two creative minds are brought together. What results is not just the sum; it's more than the sum of its parts. And I think that's a lesson for everyone interested in translation. That it's, the more voices you have, it may be that sometimes these different voices are not easily reconciled. There may be conflicts, there may be disagreements that cannot actually be resolved. But I think just having that multiplicity of voices is going to it's going to give readers a richer experience. And I think that's true of our chapters themselves, and also as about our own perspective as editors. Mm-hmm. So let's also think a little bit about this book that we've recently begun, which is also on translation and activism, but the difference is that it's something that we're writing together. Probably around 5 chapters, we haven't quite decided yet, but it will be short. One thing that I think we perhaps didn't devote that much attention to in the Routledge Handbook, and which certainly is really central to any extended thinking about translation and activism, is of course censorship. You've written and reflected a lot about the temporal implications of censorship and how the very delay that censorship imposes on the release of a text has political implications for the writer and perhaps for more. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah. Of course, as you said, we are co-authoring a book on translation and activism to be published by 2020.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We are going to expand our thoughts on translation and activism as a battle of temporalities, and the activist translator as the one who interferes with the temporal manipulations of power. 2 examples of such temporal manipulations for me are censorship and social memory engineering. As far as censorship is concerned, your question, certain works release reformist or revolutionary potentials at certain times. I mean, at certain times, certain texts can make huge impacts in the intellectual orientation of a social movement. Power is the power to manage such impacts, and it is the power to delay the intended change. So censorship is a matter of banning certain works because of their contents, but it is also to manage the revolutionary time of these texts. Sooner or later than these revolutionary moments, the work loses its power to change, I think.
So in addition to, I think it's pretty obvious that the culture into which a text is translated kind of determines how it's perceived, but you're saying that it's actually the temporality into which it is translated can determine its impact.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the ways in which an activist translation can be helpful, or an activist translator can help to an activist project, is just to battle censorship, to battle this temporal delaying effect, just today these online activism,
right. Mm-hmm.
These websites, weblogs just provide a very good opportunity for you to just propagate your ideas.
And social media as well, more generally,
Of
right?
course, yeah.
There's no screening out of what views are acceptable, no vetting process.
Exactly.
And what about social memory engineering? How do you think we should approach that?
Yeah, this temporalist structure is also true of the state's policymaking with respect to collective memories by what I call social memory surgery, or if you like, social memory engineering. I mean any kind of manipulations of a community's collective memories.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, power decides what you remember and what you forget. Part of the oppressive state's institutionalized cultural heritage activities works toward preservation of certain historical events and certain historical sites, while forgetting of certain sites and dates in the social memory. Yeah, we are going to examine in what ways a translator can resist censorship and social memory engineering as temporalist structures in this way. Rebecca, do you have any example of the activist translator's intervention into the temporalist structures?
Sure, of course. Well, I think one example that maybe I should have mentioned a few minutes ago because it's a direct lineage from that translation of Sartre's Adabiyat Cheese to his What is Literature into Persian, is Ali Shariati, who is very famous for having translated Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And of course, we know that one of the intellectuals who was instrumental in popularizing Fanon is also Sartre, right? And there's a similar concept of literature as commitment, linking this Sartre and the post-colonial theorist Fanon. Of course, Fanon's writing at the time of the Algerian Revolution in the 1960s. He's interested in offering a theory of violence, a theory of legitimate revolutionary violence, and a critique of the French colonial state.
Mm-hmm.
And when these ideas were interpreted and rearranged by Shariati, who is a revolutionary intellectual in pre-revolutionary Iran who studied at the Sorbonne, right, with government sponsorship, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously he learned French quite well there, and he immersed himself in the environment of post-colonial intellectuals, and translated Fanon. When he did that into Persian and made these anti-colonial ideas accessible, it brought about a new kind of creation, a new merger between Shi'ism and Marxist anti-colonialism, which turned out to be extremely influential and arguably made possible the revolution of 1979. That's, I think, a kind of classic example of the impact of activist translation. And we should note in passing that it's also an example of the way in which, of course, a text can acquire entirely new meanings and entirely new intentions in a translated context, just like I said at the beginning about Rancier's argument. Another example, which is perhaps almost a counterexample, also from an Iranian context, would be the reception of Heidegger in the Iranian context, which, as I understand, took place maybe in the next decade, or is that about right, the 1980s?
1990s.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Heidegger's case is a very interesting example because as a thinker who is usually known as a conservative thinker and associated with conservative thinking
Right.
and philosophy, very apolitical sometimes. It is very interesting that Heidegger was used by revolutionary forces after 1979 as a source of inspiration. Okay, so this was some kind of a revolutionary conservative or conservative revolutionary, which is very paradoxical.
Mm-hmm.
It shows that how even a conservative text, or what is believed to be a conservative text or apolitical text, can be transformed into a revolutionary source.
Right.
Or in certain historical contexts can release its revolutionary potentials. This happened also in China.
Mm-hmm.
We had a chapter in RHTA about how Darwin was used in early 1900s as a source of cultural reform in China, and how we can talk about the translations of Darwin in early 20th century China as some examples of activist translation. I think it's interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just in the case of Heidegger specifically, I think you once did mention to me that there is, although obviously making him relevant to an Iranian audience involved a radical transformation, one thing that he does have in common with, say, the mullahs of Qom is a kind of very theistic or some kind of a mystical orientation. Does that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. He is reinterpreted in a very exactly mystical framework.
Right.
In fact, yeah.
And by way of contrast, what about another theorist who I think one might consider opposite in the Iranian context, someone like Derrida? Has he had much of an influence on Iranian culture or Iranian?
Of course, this is exactly the same thing happened while I think, for example, in Anglophone academic atmospheres, Derrida is usually criticized as being not political
Exactly.
enough. But Derrida, deconstruction and post-structuralism, they're over-politicized during the reform era in early 2000s in Iran, which is again an example of how something apolitical can contribute to political projects.
Completely.
Yeah.
And what kinds of people decided to translate Derrida? Did they tend to be academics or intellectuals?
It was part of a youth event, I can
Mhm.
say. That it was some kind of enthusiasm for anything that would be labeled as post-structuralism, anything that would be labeled as deconstructionist or postmodernist. Okay, those were the days when everything with those labels was really popular among young Iranian
Mhm.
readers. And yeah, what they thought, I mean, the young generation, what they looked for in Derrida was, and in deconstruction, was some kind of overthrowing of the system of values,
Right.
as is typical of a deconstructionist project. Rebecca, you have worked extensively on the Caucasus. Could you please tell us about how translation works in those cultures?
Sure. Yeah, one reason why I think I'm really in love with the Caucasus as a literary sphere is just this incredible multilingualism of that region. It's quite possibly the most, or certainly one of the most multilingual regions of the world. In the very small territory of Dagestan, for example, you have villages of 100 people next to each other. The villages are adjacent to each other, and they speak different languages. And not only that, do they speak different languages, but they speak each other's language as well. So usually they tend to speak maybe 4 or 5 different languages, completely different, completely unrelated. It's not a case of, say, Spanish and Portuguese, different languages. And so you can imagine translation in that kind of world is really crucial. And I'm talking, I mean, the multilingualism is first and foremost oral, right? These are ancient peoples who, this goes back way before there was a written literature. But that carried over in the Soviet period into many, many different written traditions, so Chechen, and of course also scripts. Chechen, Avar, all these are languages of Dagestan, Ratul, and so forth, were all written in the Arabic script for most of the early modern period, from probably the 14th or 15th century, certainly to the 19th and even early 20th century, and then they shifted to Latin script, and then they shifted to the Cyrillic script, which they are written in now. And so again, translation is just totally inescapable. You know, perhaps not that differently from an Iranian situation. It's not, translation isn't just a kind of specialized profession of a few people in society. Every person who is literate is a translator. Every writer is a translator, because there's so much to translate, and it's so necessary to be multilingual. So translation is part of everyday life. But one thing that was interesting to me, and it's interesting also because most people don't know about this who look at it from the outside. I'm regularly asked, is Chechen like Russian, or is Georgian like Russian? You know, they tend to reduce it just to this one language, which actually isn't even related to these languages. It's a very late imposition. And so there's this kind of imposed monolingualism is imposed onto that culture. And certainly in the context of world literature, everything is seen just through a Russian prism. It's only the writers from this part of the world, for say Chechnya, who write in Russian. Those are the only ones who are really well known, right? Mm-hmm. The only ones who make it. Because then if they're in Russian, they can be translated into English. So Russian has a kind of hegemonic status. But one thing that was really interesting to me, and that I think the longer I lived there for 2 years in Georgia and traveled a lot in the region, and studied several different local languages. It was interesting for me to see how sometimes in a local context, Russian was bypassed. So you have translations from Georgian into Chechen, and Chechen into Georgian, and Russian isn't necessarily, I mean, it's obviously very important, just like, say, English is in India. But there was a lot of creative synergies that took place outside of that mediation. And Georgian, for example, became very important too. It's actually a more ancient language than Russian. So I think the translation from literatures, from different non-Russian literatures of the Caucasus is something that really fascinated me. And of course these literatures have a common root often in Arabic. So they have a whole world of, even though they're not like grammatically related, they're completely different languages, but they share a history. They share sometimes a religion as well. So that makes translation in some ways more feasible when Russian is not necessarily the mediating language.
Okay, you made very interesting points about non-Russian languages of the area. Could you give us some examples of how this multilingualism work?
Sure. Yeah, so I actually made this a focus of my first book, Writers and Rebels, the Literatures of Insurgency in the Caucasus. That's looking at this figure of the anti-colonial bandit, who, to be very simplistic perhaps, you could see a parallel with the figure of Robin Hood in the United Kingdom context, where there's a figure who steals from the rich and gives to the poor, right? He breaks the laws, in this case the laws of the Russian colonial order, and he does that to benefit his immediate community, the colonized communities. And so this is a phenomenon that you find across the Caucasus. It's very prominent in Chechen literature, very prominent in the literatures of Dagestan, very prominent in Georgia as well, which is to the south. That's a Christian region, but again, they share the same mountaineer ethos, noble banditry, we could call it. Hobsbawm is a historian who's also written about this in a kind of transnational context. And I was really fascinated by both the oral, the folkloric traditions about noble banditry. The word is abrek, that you find that, again, in probably maybe 20 or 30 of these local literary traditions. I was really interested in how that figure translated across different literatures. One really interesting thing to me was that often this noble bandit figure becomes a kind of even a saint or even a kind of Sufi mystic. In other words, he has these special powers to communicate with animals when he's in hiding from the Russian authorities. God looks favorably on him because he breaks the laws that are unjust. And you sometimes find traces of that sort of Muslim tradition. You find that even in the Christian literatures of the Georgian Caucasus, because one thing that all of these people shared in common was that they were resisting the Russian colonial occupier, and so they made this figure into a hero of theirs, and they created ballads about him. And then that happened throughout the 19th century. A lot of this is, I'm talking about oral traditions. It was later written, sometimes transcribed by local intellectuals, but in the different literatures it was written. And again, so these are different languages, but with the same motifs, same themes, and clearly these traditions are being locally translated among these peoples who are the storytellers. And then in the Soviet period, after the Russian conquest, once these regions are incorporated into Soviet rule, of course, resistance continued. There were still rebellions, there was still massacres and a lot of injustice happening, deportations. And I think some of the oral traditions probably died out by that period because there was a lot of industrialization, but this figure enters into novels, right? So there's a Chechen novel about this noble bandit. That was translated into Russian, and other local literatures like the I don't know if these names are familiar to you, but the Circassian people, for example, and other related mountaineer people, have their own literary traditions that were inspired by the Chechen text. And so I guess the point here is that this is obviously very political, right? So that the subject matter of these translations and these circulating texts was political and activist. It was about kind of carving out a space from which one could resist Russian rule, and it necessarily took place in these local literatures. The fact that it was taking place in the vernacular literatures, even just to go back to what we were saying about Luther and then sort of the turn to the vernacular, we see that too in this tradition.
And any advice for the translators who want to become involved in activist projects, some kind of political engagement?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess I should begin with myself a little bit. I've been in the UK for around 5 years, and I've become somewhat familiar with the way in which languages are taught in the UK. And I'm struck by the fact that often the teaching of languages is sometimes removed from its broader historical and especially political context, and the translation in particular of texts in, say, schools of modern languages is often treated as a politically neutral thing. You know, it's not often combined, for example, with the study of law or other subjects. I actually taught a module called Legal Cultures Compared that did have a lot of translation, but I think that was an exception. These are separate spheres. And I think that's a mistake, because I think everyone just, as soon as we begin to translate, it doesn't matter if we're fluent or how professionalized we are. I think we should, from the beginning, think of those initiatives as activist acts. In a sense, I guess I would say I would encourage the would-be activist translator, or even just the would-be translator, to really learn from other disciplines and other professions. Probably the first one that occurs to me is anthropology, because and maybe this goes back to my own first book and my own experience in general in my own intellectual life. I never really succeeded at becoming an anthropologist, although I did enter a PhD program, and I wrote a book that I could never have written without imagining myself as an anthropologist. But one of the most important lessons I took away from anthropology is this idea that if you want to know what you're commenting on, what you're engaging with, you really have to live in that society and that culture, and not just for a day or a week or a month, but for a long time. I'd say the standard expectation is about 2 years. And I would say, so bringing us to the field of translation, any translator, and particularly any activist translator who really has serious intentions about the cultures they're engaging with, the cultures they are translating from, should try to live in that society for as long as possible. But I'd say 2 years is a pretty good benchmark figure as a kind of minimum, to the extent possible. I know that for me, living in the Caucasus really changed my life, and it gave me insights that no amount of books could have given me, that I could never have learned from the news or from the classroom. I think we need to try to take translation outside of even a classroom context, even for those of us in the university. We need to integrate it into the daily lives of how people live with languages and how they live with the politics of languages, and probably just something that looks like ethnography, even if you're not a professional anthropologist, is the best way to do that. So that would be my advice, really. Think of every translator and every translator activist especially should think of themselves as a kind of ethnographer. And this is even true when we're talking about premodern literatures too, right? That maybe you can't live in a world. You're certainly, you can't live in the world of Dr. Choucault, for example. No one can, because that's past. But you can immerse yourself in these contexts. You can travel still to what was Mughal India and see the legacies and the impact, and really understand the politics that tradition has left behind. This is still available to see, and I think there's just no way around that, really, for better or worse. You really do have to do field work. Usually that would be literally involve some travel and some staying in a location for a long time, even getting bored there, feeling isolated, everything that an anthropologist goes through. So that, I think, would be my primary piece of advice, that it's a long-term process, and it looks something like what the ethnographer does.
Great advice. I sure take it. Yeah.
Great. All right, so I think I have probably given you a sense of how translation has shaped me, and perhaps that would be of interest to people just beginning now on their path. But I wonder also if you could share some impressions of how translation has shaped you, because not everyone's path is different, right? And so just some kind of parting words about what translation has meant for you and how it's made a difference in your life.
Difficult question. Translation for me is just a mode of experimentation with language, okay? So, from a collective point of view, translation was a means of identifying yourself as a writer. I mean, it was something like this for my generation, okay? You had to start with translating from European critical theory, European poetry. This gave you voice, in the language you were writing. You were originally writing. I mean, in my case, it was Persian. So, through poetry translation, especially poetry translation, because I'm very much focused on poetry translation, I tried to experiment with a variety of voices that I can choose, okay? I was not very much concerned with the matter of fidelity to the message, okay, because it was poetry and the translation most of the time. And it's very difficult to determine the message that a piece of poetry is giving the reader. There's no message, okay? This is just pure form. So for me, translating poetry was a means of shaping voices in the way I wanted. So yeah, I just tried to experiment with the styles, with tones, with voices, with languages, with different layers of language through my translation. This is how translation shaped my character as a writer in my own language. And this is not just peculiar to me. I think that many writers in my language, Persian, who are able to translate are very much inspired by their attempts in translations.
Right.
And yeah, that's it.
That's really beautiful. So just to conclude, I think I just want to note that I think my example shows that translation can become a way of kind of discovering the other, discovering the wider world. And it seems like your example is showing us that translation is ultimately a means of discovering oneself and finding one's own voice.
Discovering oneself, or I can say the shaping oneself, or fabricating yourself. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Great.